What's up, everyone? This is Be Well Informed. This episode is going to be. Let me move this a little bit so I can kind of have a little bit of room here. Alright, so this episode is going to be a little bit of a. There's going to be a couple of different things in this episode, but mainly it's going to be about the power of asking questions and how to ask these questions. This is not just about asking questions. I mean, you can ask a question like why, but why doesn't really give you specific details for the most part. Like if you have a judgment about something, like this particularly has to do with your mind and what the consequences of something are, which is really one of my favorite questions is what are the consequences of this, but we'll get into that in a minute. So if you have a judgment, like, oh, this person is whatever you think the person is, this person is a hypocrite or he's a Republican, whatever it is, and whatever you think the Republicans are. If you ask why, what exactly can you tell yourself? Oh, I don't know. He believes in capitalism or something. So why doesn't really give you a whole lot of information? So instead, like asking questions like this, these are some questions you can ask yourself. What is the result? What are the consequences of this? What are the consequences of this judgment within your mind? Like, what happens to your mind and your body? Do you get angry? Do you get annoyed? Do you get, whatever it is? And then what are the consequences of that? Do you have calm and reasonable arguments about it to yourself, or are you, are you not reasonable? Or are you going to like fight back, or whatever it is? Are you gonna like keep complaining about it in your head and so on and so forth? So I really do like what are the consequences of this as a question, because it really can point you to the truth of what is actually what your what your judgments and emotions actually do, what your thoughts actually do. And if you're needy and clingy, if you have an attachment, you can ask this question: what are the consequences of this? Well, I'm going to be chasing after this thing, and possibly even in an addictive way. And you can ask, what are the consequences of that? Well, this addictive. Or you can ask the question, what are the details surrounding this? Like, what are the what are more details that surround this? Like, what else is there about this attachment that because you're going to be answering these questions in very general terms, so you can refine it further, or you can you can just keep it there. What are the result? What is the reaction my mind has to something? What are the consequences of this? What are the consequences of that? I really do like this question. What are the consequences of this? Because you're really starting to look at what the consequences are. Now, when you're asking these questions, I want you to keep in mind that I'm not telling you to theorize. Like, oh, the consequences might be this, there might be that. I mean, you can kind of do this, but it's also more about looking at the actual consequences within the moment, or looking at previous times where something similar happened, and then looking at the consequences of that. Like, say, if you haven't had a if you had a judgment, a negative judgment towards someone, and you get angry, and then you look at that consequent, ask the question, what are the consequences of this, and then you look at another example of this happening, a couple of days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, or whatever. You'll start to get more of a picture of what is actually happening. You can ask all kinds of questions. What are judgments? Why do judgments exist? Why are you holding on to this judgment? If it is about defending, something, what are you defending? What is identity? What does this have to do with my judgment? What does this have to do with my attachments? What does this have to do with, the mind surviving? Why does my mind need an identity to really, do what it does? Where does it come up with these things? What does this mean? What this basically means is where did this come from? Like this judgment, this identity. Did it come from your parents? Did it come from your culture, your society, or whatever? And then you can, further refine that. Like, who gave me this identity or this idea for an identity? Why? What was their purpose? What is your purpose for having this identity? Like, what is your motive, your goal concerning this identity? Concerning this identity? What is your reaction to the judgment that you're having? Why is this reaction happening? Why is an interesting question in this case, because I like asking questions like what first, because you're starting to become more self-aware of what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the consequences of it is, and then once you get to that certain level, you can ask some questions like why is that happening? Why am I now doing this? But mostly it should be about what is this? What are the consequences of this? What does this exactly mean for me? Like, what is it doing? Is this helping me achieve something that I wouldn't have thought of, as achieving? Like, most people don't really think of this, but if you're having a negative judgment about something, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with negative judgments, but if you're having a negative judgment about something, what is the purpose of this judgment? Like, why is this happening? Is there like something that your mind is holding on to for the purposes of survival? Like, what is your survival goal in this particular judgment instance? Because you can almost be damn sure that there's a survival goal here. What's interesting here is that survival, by the way, is not just about physical survival. It's about much more than this. Survival. There's a good 2-part series from actualize.org called Understanding Survival, and it goes into much depth about this, but basically survival isn't just about physical survival. It has to do with your identity, survival of your identity, survival of ideas. When people are committing suicide, they're trying to survive, their identities become too much for them, so they're trying to survive that, their own identity, basically. happens when, this? What happens when I make things too complicated? When these things get too complicated and whatnot. What happens if I don't pursue this, whatever it is that you want to pursue? What happens if I decide to just do nothing? Like literally do nothing. Like I'm not even talking about being on your phone. I'm talking about literally just sitting down for 5, 10, 20 minutes and doing nothing. What happens when I do this? And a lot of times, maybe you might even have to experiment. You might even have to like find this stuff out. You're basically being a scientist. You're basically trying to uncover many different elements of your mind. What are the different aspects of this judgment? Like, what are the details surrounding this judgment? I'm not talking about details like, oh, my brother did this, this is really annoying. I'm talking about like what what are the details about you could go into that too, but it's more about understanding that your judgment is happening. But what are the details when it comes to how you're perceiving this what is happening? Like, it's not just about the judgment itself, but that is all important. But it's also about the sub sort of judgment that you have about this. Like if your brother, like if you had a judgment like, I don't know, my neighbor's always taking, my neighbor's always taking stuff from me and whatnot. That's one thing. That's not really a judgment so much as it is a fact. But the reason why this fact annoys you is because you find it to be annoying. Why? What are the details surrounding this? Why is this happening? What are the consequences of this? What are the consequences of that? I really do like this question. What are the consequences of this? Because it really kind of digs deep into what actual reality is. In this particular case, I mean the mind reality, but the consequences. What are your reactions doing? Am I actually succeeding at what I'm trying to do? Like if I'm chasing happiness, but the way that I chase happiness is trying to find out the success, is what I'm doing actually working? Or am I only finding temporary moments of happiness? That's like another good question you can kind of ask. And then you can ask me, why do I think that this other strategy would work? Why does my mind think that this strategy is better than doing something different? What is my survival goal? Like, it's not just about physical survival. It's not just about monetary, getting more money or monetary survival, but it's also identity survival. It's also about different types of survival that exist. What is the consequence of this survival need? Like what happens when I have this survival need? What happens then? Just keep asking that question. What are the consequences of this? Okay, then what are the consequences of that? Okay, good. What are the consequences of this? And you can keep going deeper and deeper. You don't really have to go too deeply, but what are the consequences of this is really one of my favorite questions, because you're not really because of the way that a lot of people do introspection, or asking questions is asking why is this happening? What? But the problem with asking the question why, there's a couple problems with doing this. One of them is it doesn't really give you a whole lot of information. You don't really have a whole lot of details. Like, you ask the question, why am I having this judgment? Your mind's going to go into all those details, like, oh, well, my brother did this. I had, this happened so many times, it gets really annoying and whatnot. It doesn't really give you details. Like, that kind of information is only skin deep. It doesn't really help you. So I like to ask questions like, what are the consequences of this? What caused this judgment in the first place? I'm not talking about the cause, the perceived cause. Like, oh, my brother, this friend of mine is always taking things from me and whatnot. I'm talking about the first instance of this, of annoyance that you have. Like, what? It's not even about the first instance. Like, what is the what's the word I'm looking for? What is the? Damn it! I can't believe I forgot it was. What is the survival needs related to this? What is the consequence of this? But I forgot where I was going to go originally with it, but doesn't really matter. Like, there's a bunch of questions you can ask like that. Like, what questions are usually more important than why questions? Why questions it can be useful, but only if you apply the why questions after like several amounts of what questions. What are the consequences of this? What are my reactions to this? What survival needs are not being met, which caused this, basically. Why is this being, why is this have such a strong effect on me? And in this particular instance, when you ask a question like that, don't answer with the judgment itself, but answer with something like that puts a lot of distance in between you and the judgment. Like, say you have a judgment like, my internet is really slow right now. This is annoying. You put it into context like, the slow internet caused a reaction of annoyance, which caused me to, say, why is the internet so slow right now? It's annoying. And so you're going beyond this perceived you that you think, that your mind thinks you are, and you're going into actual reality by just going beyond this perceived you, because the reason why these things have an effect over you is because you, not completely, but for the most part, is because you have labeled them as you. My feelings are hurt. My mind is set. I am so annoyed at this person. I did this. You did this to me. See what I mean? So, instead of saying my feelings are hurt, the feelings inside of me are hurt. And it sounds stranger, but it puts distance in between you and the feelings, because you're not really. The feelings are not. You're not the feelings. You're not the thoughts. My mind is annoyed right now. Stuff like this. Trying to put distance in between you and the thoughts and the emotions may not necessarily completely remove you from them, but you'll have to start thinking consciously, because the problem here is that your mind is often thinking unconsciously. Another thing to keep in mind too, I'm going to be talking about this more in other episodes or in other videos, but another thing to keep in mind in the future is that when your emotions are natural reactions to what is happening. Like if you get startled, your natural reaction might be fear or anger, or both. You might get fearful and then you'll get angry really quickly. Um, but then your mind takes over, and what your mind does at that point is it sort of like almost sees these emotions as something that has to respond to or protect you from. And so the way it does this is by, listening to it and saying, "Oh, this is really annoying," or resisting it. "Oh no, I can't have this emotion," especially if you're like a spiritual person. Um, or you're going to be just watching the emotions in the mind while it's doing whatever it's doing. Um, because emotions blind you to what is. It's not really about the judgments and the thoughts for the most part. It's more about the emotions. Um, you have a natural. When you have an emotion, your mind's response is to agree or disagree because it thinks that it has to do something about this emotion instead of just watching this emotion. And this causes problems because 99 times out of 100, if not more, 100 times out of 100, when your mind does this, it's a reaction. It does it very sloppily. It does it very horribly, and you have a very black and white thinking surrounding this. So you have a very judgmental thing surrounding this, which doesn't actually improve the emotional position or improve the emotions. It actually makes them worse, because the mind is either trying to decrease the emotion or is trying to control the emotion. Agrees with the emotion. Even when it's agreeing with the emotion, it's still trying to, um, find itself more calm or whatever. Trying to get rid of this emotion, basically. But doing this doesn't really get rid of the emotion, but it doesn't really understand this because the mind doesn't see with awareness. The mind isn't really aware. It's just, especially when it has this automatic process of seeing this emotion and finding this emotion can be pretty powerful, and then judging what the emotion is telling the mind, or what awareness has showed the mind. And if the mind would have just let the emotion do whatever it did, it wouldn't necessarily be as powerful as it is now. It's really strange. Like your mind is like a reaction machine. That's why a lot of people say you don't have free will. You do or you don't. It doesn't really matter. But in a lot of senses, you don't have free will, because your mind is mostly about reaction. And there's another side of this, of a pro-action. And there's many ways of doing this, but your mind is a reaction to whatever's happening around you 99 times out of 100. There's an episode I made on my podcast a while back called "Your Mind Is Only Past." Basically, what this means is that your mind is only knows about the past. It doesn't know about the present. You might be arguing that this isn't accurate because you're aware of the present. But the awareness isn't necessarily the mind. What the awareness is basically the way you can think of it is that awareness is actually universal. It's not really belonging to anyone. But even if you don't really want to believe this, or you don't believe this at all, awareness is not the mind. Awareness is aware of the mind. What awareness is, in very general terms, is what is aware. And the mind isn't aware because the mind 99 times out of 100 is programming. So it's not really about trying to change or stop the programming so much as it is about understanding it, about seeing it for what it really is. And that's why I like asking questions like, what are the consequences of this? What does this mean for me? Like, what is its purpose when it comes to survival, things like this. So, anyways, bit of a longer video, but that's still an interesting video to me making. This would be well informed. I'm hoping to do a long video form within the next week or so, depending on how long it's going to take me to make. But this is Be Well Informed, and I'll talk to the next episode.